Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling a big one, especially for those of you prepping for the UPSC International Relations exam.
Yeah, this one's a classic.
It's a question that's been debated for centuries. Is war really just politics by other means?
Well, to help us unpack that, we're turning to one of the giants of military thought, Karl von Clausewitz, and his masterpiece, On War.
On war. It's pretty much required reading if you want to understand how the world works, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a dense book, for sure,
Yeah.
but Clausewitz's core argument is surprisingly simple. He saw war as an extension of political activity.
So not just some random act of violence, but a calculated tool that states use to get what they want.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
like hitting a dead end in a negotiation and saying, all right, time to bring out the heavy artillery.
That makes sense. And this idea really gained traction in the 19th century, right?
Right.
When wars were mainly fought between states with clear goals like grabbing territory.
You got it. And what's fascinating is that back then, the aggressor, the one who started the fight, usually won. Something like 80% of wars were won by the side that struck first.
Wow, 80%. That really makes you think about the so-called rationality of war.
It does. But of course, the world has changed a lot since Clausewitz's time. I mean, think about today's global economy. Countries are so interconnected that launching a war could trigger a financial meltdown that hurts everyone.
Yeah, it's not as simple as just taking land and resources anymore.
Right, and that's a key point that critics of Clausewitz raise. His model may have been revolutionary back then, but is it still relevant in the 21st century? With the rise of total war, where entire societies are mobilized for conflict, the cost-benefit analysis of war has gotten way more complex.
Okay, so we've got Clausewitz's view of war as a tool of politics. But obviously there are other ways of looking at this. Let's bring in some other perspectives. What about the realists? What's their take?
Well, for realists, war is an unfortunate but inherent part of international relations. It all boils down to power struggles between states.
Okay, so like a high-stakes game of chess, where the pieces represent real lives and global stability is at stake.
Exactly.
But if states are these rational actors, like realists claim, then how do we explain wars that seem totally illogical, like the U.S. involvement in Vietnam? Was that really just about self-interest, or was there something about the international system itself that pushed the U.S. into that quagmire?
That's where the different flavors of realism come in. You've got classical realists who might say it was driven by state egoism, a kind of inherent desire for dominance. But then you have the neo-realists who focus on the anarchic nature of the international system.
Anarchy meaning.
Meaning there's no world government, no global police force to keep everyone in check. So states are constantly jockeying for power and security, even if it means getting into seemingly irrational conflicts.
So it's either ego or a desperate grab for security. But either way, realists seem to agree that the potential for war is always bubbling under the surface.
Yeah, but they also stress the importance of the balance of power. The idea is that states are less likely to go to war if they think they'll lose. It's like a silent agreement. Don't pick a fight, you can't win.
I can see the logic there. But I'm guessing not everyone buys into this rather grim outlook. What about the liberals? How do they see things?
Liberals offer a slightly more hopeful perspective. They believe that peace is the natural state of affairs, even if it's a bit fragile. They acknowledge that war can happen, but they think it arises under specific circumstances.
So when do liberals think war is likely to break out? What are those circumstances?
Well, they point to three main factors. First, like the realists, they recognize state egoism. When states act purely out of self-interest, conflict can flare up. Second, they highlight economic nationalism.
Economic nationalism. What's that exactly?
It's basically the pursuit of economic self-sufficiency, even if it means sacrificing cooperation. This can lead to fierce competition between countries and ultimately to war. And the third factor they emphasize is the nature of a state's political system.
Okay, so a country's internal politics can make it more or less likely to go to war? How does that work?
Right. Liberals argue that authoritarian states where power is concentrated in the hands of a few are more prone to militarism and aggressive foreign policies. Democracies, on the other hand, are seen as more peaceful, at least when they're dealing with each other.
So more democracy, more economic interdependence. That's the liberal recipe for a more peaceful world.
Yeah, you could say that. But remember, we've only scratched the surface here. There are other more critical voices that we need to hear from.
All right, let's hear what they have to say. Who's got a bone to pick with the realists and liberals?
Well, one group that challenges those mainstream views is the Marxists. They bring in the economic angle, arguing that war often serves the interests of the powerful, especially under capitalism.
So for Marxists, it's not just about states paddling for dominance, but about deeper economic forces at work.
Exactly. They see war as a tool used by capitalist elites to secure resources, expand markets, and maintain their grip on power.
So it's about following the money, seeing who profits from these conflicts.
You got it. And they point to examples like World War I as a prime example of how imperialist ambitions fueled by economic greed can lead to global catastrophe.
So for Marxists, the question isn't just why do states go to war, it's who benefits?
Yeah.
And the answer, they'd say, is certainly not the average person.
Right. Now, another critical perspective comes from the anarchists. They really focus on the role of powerful states in perpetuating war.
Okay, so they'd say even states that claim to be promoting peace are often using war to further their own interests.
That's their argument. They see these powerful states exploiting weaker nations to maintain or even expand their global influence.
So it's about challenging the whole idea that some states have the right to dominate others.
Exactly. And it's worth mentioning the work of Noam Chomsky here. He's written extensively on this idea of hegemonic war.
Hegemonic war.
Yeah, it's basically the idea that powerful states use war to maintain their global dominance, often disguising it as humanitarian intervention or spreading democracy.
So it raises questions about the real motives behind those interventions. Are we really seeing altruism or just a clever PR campaign?
Right. And of course, we can't forget the feminist perspective. It adds a whole other layer to our understanding of war.
Yeah, absolutely. We can't ignore the human cost of conflict.
Feminist scholars highlight the gendered nature of war. The fact that wars are fought mostly by men but disproportionately impact women and marginalized groups.
It's a point we often overlook when we talk about war in these abstract terms. States' power strategy. But the reality is that the burden of war falls unevenly.
Exactly. And some feminist scholars go even further, arguing that the way we think about international relations, this focus on competition, domination, and military strength, is rooted in a masculine worldview.
So it's like we've created a global system that rewards aggression and violence.
That's the argument.
Mm.
And it makes you wonder, can we truly achieve peace without addressing those underlying issues, without challenging that mindset?
It's a profound question for sure.
It is. Now, with all these different perspectives in mind, let's go back to where we started. We began with Clausewitz and his idea that war is a continuation of politics. But now we've seen all these critiques, these challenges to the traditional way of thinking. So the question is Clausewitz's framework still useful in today's world?
It's a good question.
Okay.
After everything we've talked about, it's hard to say for sure. I mean, the world has changed so much since Clausewitz's time.
Right.
We've got non-state actors like terrorist groups waging war on their own terms. We have weapons of mass destruction that make the consequences of conflict almost unimaginable. And we've got new battlefields like cyberspace, where the lines between war and peace are blurred.
You've hit the nail on the head. The world has transformed in ways Clausewitz couldn't have dreamed of. But that doesn't necessarily mean his ideas are totally irrelevant. There are still parts of his thinking that resonate even in our complex, interconnected world.
Okay, so what parts of his model do you think still hold up today?
Well, for one, his core insight that war is fundamentally a political act driven by some underlying goal or objective. That still rings true. Even with all the changes we've discussed, conflict at its core is about power, influence, and pursuing interests.
So even if the methods and the players have evolved, the basic motivations behind war haven't really changed all that much.
I think that's a fair assessment. And the concept of strategy, which was so central to Clausewitz's thinking, is still incredibly relevant. Even in the age of cyber warfare and terrorism, understanding strategy, being able to adapt to new challenges and exploit new opportunities is crucial.
That makes sense. So maybe it's not about tossing out Clausewitz completely, but about updating his ideas for the 21st century. We need a new framework that accounts for the complexities of modern warfare while still acknowledging that conflict is inherently political.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting, especially for our UPSC aspirants out there. By grappling with these challenges, by understanding the limitations of traditional models like Clausewitz's, and by exploring new ways of thinking about conflict, you're developing the kind of sophisticated understanding of international relations that will really set you apart.
It's not just about memorizing facts and figures. It's about applying those concepts to the real world and understanding how they're being reshaped by current events.
It's about recognizing that the study of international relations is a dynamic process constantly evolving as the world around us changes.
So it's a field that keeps you on your toes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It demands that we stay engaged, informed, and intellectually nimble. And that's what we're trying to do here, diving deep into these complex issues, challenging assumptions, and exploring different perspectives.
All right, so we've established that Clausewitz, while still offering valuable insights, needs a bit of an upgrade to really grasp the complexities of war in the 21st century. But before we wrap things up, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what this all means for the future. If war is no longer a simple tool for states to get what they want, if the old rules no longer apply, how do we even begin to think about conflict resolution in the years to come?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one we'll be tackling head-on in the final part of our deep dive. We'll be looking at the evolving landscape of war, the challenges posed by new technologies and non-state actors, and the potential for finding peaceful solutions in an increasingly interconnected and volatile world. So stay tuned, folks. The best is yet to come.
Welcome back, everyone, for the final part of our deep dive. So we've been unpacking Clausewitz's idea of war as an extension of politics, explored critiques from various schools of thought, and we've acknowledged how much the world has changed since his time. So where do we go from here? How do we even think about conflict resolution in this messy, unpredictable 21st century?
Yeah, that's the real challenge now, isn't it? The old playbook, relying on military might or the threat of force, it just might not cut it anymore. We need some new strategies, new tools, and maybe even a whole new way of thinking.
All right, so let's get practical.
Oh.
What could these new tools and strategies look like?
Well, one thing's for sure. We've got to prioritize diplomacy and multilateralism. Meaning strengthening international institutions like the United Nations, giving them more power to mediate disputes and enforce international law. It's about moving away from unilateral action, going it alone, and embracing those collective solutions. Because let's face it, no single country, no matter how powerful, can solve global problems all by itself.
So more cooperation, less going rogue. It sounds like a pretty big departure from the realist perspective we discussed earlier.
Yeah, it is. It requires us to recognize that in our interconnected world, security is a shared responsibility. What happens in one corner of the globe can quickly ripple out and affect everyone else. We need to move beyond that narrow self-interest that often fuels conflict and really embrace a more holistic approach to peace and security.
It makes sense. But let's be real. Diplomacy can be a slow and frustrating process.
Yeah.
What about those situations where conflict is already brewing or even boiling over? Is there any room for military intervention in this new framework?
That's a tough one, and there's no easy answer. But if we do use military intervention, it should be an absolute last resort undertaken with a clear mandate from the international community and a strong commitment to minimizing civilian casualties. And most importantly, it needs to be part of a much broader strategy, one that addresses those root causes of the conflict. Otherwise, we're just putting a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound.
So it's not just about stopping the bleeding, it's about addressing the underlying infection.
Precisely. It means investing in conflict prevention and peace-building efforts, tackling issues like poverty, inequality, political oppression, all those factors that contribute to instability. It also means promoting intercultural understanding, supporting civil society organizations that are working on the ground and pushing for sustainable development. It's about creating societies that are resilient to conflict, where people have a genuine stake in peace.
And for our UPSC aspirants out there, this is where your studies become so crucial. Understanding those complexities, the connections between economics, political systems, social dynamics, and security. That's how you become effective policymakers and diplomats. It's about seeing the whole picture while also being able to zero in on the specific details of a conflict.
Exactly. It's not just about memorizing theories or historical events. It's about developing that critical lens, that ability to analyze situations, identify those root causes, and then craft creative solutions. It's about understanding that there are multiple perspectives on every conflict and being able to navigate those different viewpoints.
It's a challenge, no doubt, but it's also incredibly exciting. It feels like we're at this turning point in international relations, a new era that demands fresh ideas, new approaches, and a new generation of leaders ready to tackle these complex challenges head-on.
I agree. And while the future may seem uncertain, I'm optimistic. I believe that by embracing that complexity, by challenging the old ways of thinking, by working together across borders and disciplines, we can create a world where peace is not just a dream, but a reality.
It's a powerful vision and one worth working towards. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the question. Is war really just politics by other means? We've explored Clausewitz's ideas, grappled with those different perspectives, and considered what it all means for the future of conflict resolution.
And for our UPSC aspirants, remember this is just the starting point. Keep digging into these ideas, explore the recommended readings, and never stop questioning, analyzing, and seeking out new perspectives. It's a lifelong journey, this pursuit of understanding international relations, and it's absolutely crucial for building a more peaceful and just world.
And to all our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode with anyone who might be interested in exploring the complex world of war and peace. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving for a better future.